Thank you very much, and I'm sure I would be short, but after Commissioner Stewart's presentation, I hope I can keep your attention. The Immigration Division, I like to say, has been the stepchild of the Ministry of National Security, because a lot of the times we never get what we want, but yet so much is demanded of us. Let's see if I can get this to work. Right. So, the role of the Immigration Division really, and this was said at a Joint Select Committee of Parliament, is to safeguard the economic, political, social, and cultural well-being of Trinidad and Tobago, as well as to provide an efficient and effective passport service, as well as to manage the movement of persons into Trinidad and Tobago. But it's much more than that. The Immigration Division really manages migration into Trinidad and Tobago. And what we see in Trinidad and Tobago is a mixed migration flow. And there are a number of persons who come into Trinidad and Tobago. Economic migrants, persons who are looking for a better way of life. Asylum seekers and refugees, persons who are fleeing persecution in their home country. You have victims of trafficking. You have stateless persons, and while we don't have internally displaced persons, really, some of them who are internally displaced in their home country eventually find their way into Trinidad and Tobago. And the Immigration Division has to manage all of the persons. Every foreign national coming into Trinidad and Tobago has to have some kind of permission from the Immigration Division to remain in the country. Even citizens and residents of Trinidad and Tobago, when they come from abroad, have to seek admission from the Immigration Division. Now, for foreign nationals, and it is an enshrined right, this freedom of movement, you have the right to emigrate, that is to leave your place, your country, and go somewhere else. But you don't necessarily have the right to immigrate. And for most migrants, they are not welcomed unconditionally into the countries to which they move. Prior to perhaps the 1920s, when there were no borders and there were no passports and visas and whatnot, people moved freely. And then countries instituted passports and visa schemes to regulate the flow of persons into a country. And for us, we did the same thing. We have an Immigration Act, which is an act respecting the admission of persons into Trinidad and Tobago. And the act outlines several ways that person could enter Trinidad and Tobago. And for foreign nationals, they could come in temporarily as tourists or students or business travelers. They could come for longer periods on work permits, missionary permits, ministers' permits, and there's the expectation that at the end of the permit or at the end of the time given to them by the Immigration Division, that they will leave. A lot of them don't, because like we say here, Trinidad nice. It's a paradise, and some of them have actually told us that when we interview them. So a lot of them stay. Now, there are persons who, for one reason or the other, and in accordance with the legislation, can immigrate. They can get permanent residence in Trinidad and Tobago, and some of them can get citizenship of Trinidad and Tobago. And the decision to grant citizenship or permanent residence comes from a recommendation by the Immigration Division, because we interview persons to determine whether or not those persons should be granted those rights, because citizenship and residence carries with it a lot of rights. Come on. Okay. All right. Now, what I can say is that the Immigration Division is the singular government agency responsible for the administration and enforcement of immigration, passport, and citizenship laws. There's a little typo there. What that means is that the presence of all foreign nationals in Trinidad and Tobago is controlled by the Immigration Division. There are two main areas that immigration would fall into in terms of national security. And there are a lot of it, but I'm focusing on two main areas. One is border control. We talk about border security this morning, and border control has to do with who comes into Trinidad and Tobago. For some correction, and I mean Customs has their act, but for the purposes of immigration, there are 14 ports of entry. 3 in Tobago and 11 in Trinidad. And every person seeking admission into Trinidad and Tobago has to arrive at one of those ports of entry. There are some suffrage ports, for example, Claxton Bay is a suffrage port as designated by Customs as such, and immigration will go to that port of entry to deal specifically with the vessels coming in there. And while I'm saying that, we operate not only at the airport, but we are at every port of entry in Trinidad and Tobago. We have a 24-hour operation. The only one we are not stationed 24 hours at is the port of Galeota. But at every other port of entry, you will find immigration and customs. So that's just to make some corrections. So anybody who's arriving outside of one of those ports of entry and not presenting themselves to an immigration officer has entered the country illegally and therefore is subject to prosecution because it is an offense under the Immigration Act. Now, what do we do at the port of entry, and more in particular the airport where you find the bulk of foreign nationals coming in? And over the years, our role has changed from facilitating and everybody wanting immigration officers to smile and welcome everybody with open arms. And then when you have terrorism taking place, and everybody is concerned now about who's coming in and who might be a threat to national security, are now asking immigration to tighten the borders, control more. Now, this started really in 1990 during the coup. And in 1990 and prior to that, a lot of nationals, especially Canadians and US nationals, were able to come into Trinidad and Tobago with a driver's license and a copy of a birth certificate. After the coup, and that was a big facilitation, after the coup, everybody had to produce a passport. Every single person coming into Trinidad and Tobago had to have a passport. And the Immigration Division maintains a record of every single person coming into Trinidad and Tobago. And there's a whole travel history of that particular individual. So the Immigration Division will know who comes in, when they come in, how often they come in, if they overstay their time. So we monitor every single person coming in. We have changed our operations. We now have what is called an integrated border management system at the ports of entry. And this integrated border management system is tied to several databases. It's tied to the Interpol database for lost and stolen passports. And we link with JRCC, the Joint Regional Command Center, and we upload all our advanced passenger information from JRCC. In addition to which, it's tied to the local watch list and the regional watch list. So before persons arrive in Trinidad and Tobago, we already have them flagged. So we already know who's coming in. What we have seen recently is that there's an influx of persons coming in with fraudulent passports from various countries. And most of them are passing through here trying to get to somewhere else. And that's to the US or to Canada. And they have some really ingenious ways of doing it. And it's not only those who are trying to move to get into the US and Canada. We have seen attacks on our own passports of persons trying to use Trinidad and Tobago passports to go to the UK and to even countries within the Caribbean. And some have tried to enter Trinidad and Tobago with a fraudulent Trinidad and Tobago passport. Now, are they part of terrorism? We don't know. Are they here for some illegal activity? Most likely. Because that's the trend that we are seeing. And we, as the Immigration Division, we have to constantly monitor what's going on and then disseminate that kind of information to other agencies. Even passengers leaving Trinidad and Tobago, the Immigration Division monitors. And every vessel, every seagoing vessel, and even every aircraft has to get a clearance from immigration before they can leave. On arrival, before anybody can enter a vessel, apart from Coast Guard and Customs, nobody can go on board a vessel unless everybody on board that vessel has been examined by the Immigration Division. Now, when we talk border control, there are different ways that we manage it. One is by the way of visas. And I think a lot of people don't know that some foreign nationals require a visa to come into Trinidad and Tobago. A visa is used as a way, a mechanism to push your borders out. You screen passengers and persons from on the outside before allowing them to reach Trinidad and Tobago shores. And that's the purpose of a visa, to do that pre-screening, that pre-vetting, before allowing them to land in Trinidad. But still, the issuance of a visa does not guarantee that that person would be admitted. There are other criteria that has to be satisfied before a person would be allowed entry. The other thing is that we would issue what is called a landing certificate or an entry certificate. And if you don't have one of those in your passport, then questions are asked, how did you get into the country? Because every person who arrives at a legal port of entry and has appeared before an immigration officer will have that stamp in their passport, which tells them how long they are to be in the country. And there are varying sections that would denote whether it's a visitor, a student, somebody who's here on a work permit, somebody who is here doing missionary work, somebody who is here under the CSME. So that certificate denotes what that whole person has been admitted for, that particular individual. Persons, more often than not, overstay the time that they're in the country. And that's where the over 100 and something persons came in when we searched the database. Persons who have overstayed, but we also saw they would have overstayed and some would have left. But from the border management system, we also saw at least 50,000 who had overstayed and have not left. So the question is, where are these people? And most of them here working illegally. And they're finding jobs. And the thing about that is that they're accepting wages that are a lot below what is the minimum wage. That in itself poses a problem for us, both an economic and a social problem. And it's something that we have to bear in mind. because they drive wages down. But in addition to that, because of so many of them, they could drive rent up. And sometimes these are not the things that we factor in when we're talking about national security, or we're talking in the broader sense of human security. And of course, based on our examination of an individual, if we determine that that person is not a bona fide national or a bona fide visitor, then we would refuse that person entry and send them back to their last port of entry. Of course, with the Jamaicans, we've had a lot of challenges with that. But with the Jamaican nationals, we've always had a problem with them. And I'm saying this openly, and I don't expect it to go anywhere, really. But we've had a number of challenges with the Jamaican nationals. And I mean, narcotics will tell you, OCNFB will tell you that a lot of the Jamaican nationals are the ones who bring drugs into the country. And we've seen that happening. We have seen from our own investigations, a lot of them joining gangs or involved in a lot of illegal activities. So we refuse a lot of persons, but really it only amounts to about 3% of the persons who are seeking entry into Trinidad and Tobago. But if you refuse 15 people off of one flight, then that in itself is like immigration just refusing nationals from one country, and it creates a whole conundrum. That word has been used a lot today. A whole conundrum with other countries within the Caribbean. All right. As I mentioned before, part of our responsibility is to examine persons seeking extensions of stay. We land them for a period of time. You want to stay longer, you have to subject yourself to an examination by an immigration officer. Because I need to find out, if you told me that you were coming here for 2 weeks on vacation, we admitted you for 6 months, and that's a CARICOM agreement, that CARICOM nationals would be admitted for a period of 6 months. You spend 6 months in the country, and then you're coming to me and you're asking me for an extension of your stay because you like it here and you're on vacation. Now, I tell people the only persons I know in any organization who have so much vacation leave is police officers, Defense Force persons, sometimes, Rodney, and immigration officers. I don't know anybody else who have that amount of vacation leave. So more often, teachers, so more often than not, these persons are here working illegally. I mentioned before as well, if I can go back, right, permanent residence and citizenship. And there are only 4 ways, really, that people could get permanent residence in Trinidad and Tobago. You're married to a citizen or resident. You're the parent or grandparent of a citizen or resident. You have been employed in the country for more than 5 years and can contribute economically and otherwise to Trinidad and Tobago, or you are a former citizen of Trinidad and Tobago. That's the 4 ways you can get residence. Or you're the child of a resident or a citizen. Once you get residence, you can then, after 5 or 8 years, depending on what your nationality is, you can apply for citizenship. And again, we have to ensure that when we examine for citizenship, that you are somebody that we want to be in the country and that we want to give those rights to, the right to vote, the right to have a say in what happens in Trinidad and Tobago. The other big part of our operations is enforcement. Enforcement of the immigration laws. And we have an investigation section within immigration, and together with the investigations unit, the immigration officers, there are police officers from CID attached to immigration to assist immigration in the investigation, arrest, and prosecution of persons who have breached the Immigration Act. And every immigration officer has the authority and powers of a constable to enforce any provision of this act, the regulations, or any order lawfully made under this act or the regulations relating to the arrest, detention, or deportation of anybody. We also have the power to, without a warrant, arrest and detain for an inquiry or for deportation any person who, upon reasonable grounds, is suspected of being a person referred to in those sections. And I wanted to highlight those sections because sometimes we do things and we're not sure about what we're doing. And under Section 9.4 that is referred to there, and I want you to take note, and the Chief Immigration Officer may order the release of any such person. And 9.4 refers to where a permitted entrant is, in the opinion of the minister, a person who, and that some of that has been delegated to the Chief Immigration Officer, practices, assists in the practice of, or shares in the avails of prostitution or homosexualism, has been convicted of an offense and sentenced to a term of imprisonment for 1 or more years, has become an inmate of any prison or reformatory. Because when Mr. Gift prosecutes the person who he finds with drugs, and he goes to the prison, and he serves his sentence, what happens to him then? He has to be handed over to immigration to finish the process. Right? He has to. IDC, the Immigration Detention Center, because that person now has to be deported. He is now what we call a person who belongs to the prohibited classes of persons. And there are quite a number of them, from A to Q. Quite a number of them who fall within the prohibited classes. Another set is who came into Trinidad and Tobago or remains therein with a false or improperly issued passport or visa or other document pertaining to his admission, or by reason of any false or misleading information, force, stealth, or fraudulent or improper means, whether exercised by himself or any other person. And Section 22(1)(I) refers to where he has knowledge thereof, any public officer shall send a written report to the minister in respect of paragraphs A to C, and to the Chief Immigration Officer in respect of paragraphs D to I, and they're referring here to Section 22(1)(I), which says that any person other than a citizen of Trinidad and Tobago who either before or after the commencement of this act came into Trinidad and Tobago at any place other than a port of entry and has eluded examination or inquiry under this act. And there are others under Section 22 who any public officer is supposed to report and give notice to the Chief Immigration Officer so that the Immigration Division can detain, interview, and determine what is that person's status in Trinidad and Tobago. So that the investigation section will investigate what we refer to as immigration crimes. And there is such thing as an immigration crime. And Section 40 of the Immigration Act refers to all of the offenses under the Immigration Act, which are summary offenses, but carry a first offense to a fine of $50,000 and imprisonment for 3 years, and any subsequent conviction to a fine of $100,000 and imprisonment for 5 years. And some of it is a person who comes into, and this is any person, be it citizen of Trinidad and Tobago or a foreign national, comes into TNT at a place other than a port of entry and fails to report an immigration officer for examination, makes a false promise of employment or any false representation by reason of which a person is induced to seek admission to Trinidad and Tobago, or is assisted in any attempt to seek admission unlawfully to Trinidad and Tobago, or by reason of which his admission is procured. It's an immigration offense. Induces, aids, or abet, or attempts to induce, aid, or abet any person to violate a provision of this act or the regulations, or to commit any offense under this act or the regulations. And this section, the offenses go from A to J. So there are a number of immigration crimes. Human smuggling. And sometimes I realize that we use smuggling and human trafficking interchangeably, and there's a marked difference between the two. And sometimes we have to be mindful of what it is we're talking about and make the distinction. So with human smuggling, which is aiding and abetting the illegal entry of a person into the country, you find that there are many ways in which it can be done. We talk about fraudulent passports, fraudulent visas, fraudulent work permits, which seems to be a trend now. People producing a lot of fraudulent visas, fraudulent work permits, fraudulent missionary permits, fraudulent minister's permit. The only person who can issue a minister's permit is the minister, issued by the Immigration Division on behalf of the minister. All right? Some of the other immigration crimes would include human trafficking, because most of our trafficking, as Alana will tell you later on, has to do with foreign nationals who are coming into Trinidad and Tobago. And at the end of the day, I said earlier that any foreign national in Trinidad and Tobago is under the control of the Immigration Division. And that's why there are immigration officers at the counter-trafficking unit. The counter-trafficking unit is made up of immigration and police officers. The transnational organized crime has immigration officers as well. The detention center. The detention center is a place where we would detain all persons who we suspect are in breach of the Immigration Act, pending an inquiry. When it started off and was set up in November of 2009, it was expected that we would have a few persons coming in and whatnot. The capacity there, I think, is 135. But it's been full all the time for the last several months. And in fact, it's overflowing because of the amount of persons who we are finding in breach of the Immigration Act. When police make a raid on an establishment and foreign nationals are found, those foreign nationals are supposed to be handed over to immigration unless they have committed some criminal offense, some strict liability offense that the police are going to prosecute and then at the end of the day hand over to immigration. If there are no prosecution involved, all of those persons are supposed to be referred to the Immigration Division. At the IDC right now, we have a number of African nationals, and it has been coming up quite often in the news. Every time the Emancipation Support Committee decides that it wants to raise the issue, it comes out there. And the challenge for the Immigration Division in repatriating a number of those persons is the fact that other countries have closed their routes to us to transit these persons through their country. So we have been in a bind trying to get African nationals repatriated to Africa, which is why on 2 occasions we had to charter a plane to take them to their home country at significant expense to the state. And when you go into a serious interview with the individuals, you would start to see the signs and make a distinction whether it is one or the other. And that's how we would know whether we are prosecuting or whether we're referring to the counter-trafficking units. The other big thing for immigration, apart from border control and enforcement of the immigration laws, is passports. The Immigration Division is responsible for processing passports for citizens of Trinidad and Tobago. And in doing so, we have to ensure that the passport that we give to citizens has security features that cannot be forged. That's why ever so often we have to upgrade our passports. Otherwise, you begin to compromise the integrity of your travel document, which then compromises national citizens of Trinidad and Tobago when they travel abroad. So that, for us, we have one production site, which is in keeping with ICAO standards, one production site for passports. Granted, of late, we've had a challenge with how long it takes to process a passport. But for us, we have to ensure that when we interview somebody for a passport, that passport is being issued to the right individual, and it is in protecting a person's identity. We have had several cases of persons who are trying to impersonate somebody else and bringing in their birth certificate to get a passport. We have had several cases like that. So when we have to interview somebody, we go through all of the documents. We actually are connected to the Registrar General's database so that we can verify all of the documents that a national is presenting to us before issuing a passport. Embedded in that whole system is also what we call a facial recognition system. So that when you come to renew your passport, our border management system automatically checks your facial features against what we already have in the database. We want to expand that to include fingerprints and to do what is called an electronic passport, or an e-passport that has a chip embedded in it with all of your biometric features. And that is the highest level of security for a passport. And that's where we're hoping to go in terms of issuing passports to citizens of Trinidad and Tobago. I think I have only one more slide after this, if I could get to it. Right. The division has a large database. Like I said, we have records of all persons coming into and leaving Trinidad and Tobago, all aircraft and seagoing vessels coming into and leaving Trinidad and Tobago, and whoever is on board. We have a database of all citizens of Trinidad and Tobago who have applied for a passport together with their photographs. And because of that, we are able to provide a lot of information and intelligence to other security agencies. Because many times we would be asked, we need a photograph and an address of a particular individual who is a person of interest. So we provide a lot of information to other agencies, and they also provide a lot of information to us, which we would put onto the border management system so that we can track individuals and we can flag individuals. So it has been, over the years, a very close working relationship with Special Branch and Traffic Index, SSA, OCNFB, who is in the immigration office every day going through cards and profiling passengers. I didn't see Mr. Giff mention immigration, so I have to take him to task for that. So we work very, very closely with a lot of agencies within national security, providing that kind of intelligence, that kind of information, so they too can continue with their investigation. And we, of course, as well, in our own investigations, seek the assistance of all of these intelligence agencies. So I know that my time is up. And with that, I say thank you for listening.